Happy Sabbath. I'm sure one event which is on all of our minds right now is what we're seeing going on in Ukraine. As the world right now has been gripped with shock and horror with the attack that is happening as Russia has rolled into Ukraine and they've displaced millions of Ukrainians. The United Nations now estimates that 3.2 million Ukrainians have already fled the country and seek of refuge, and another 6.5 million have been displaced within the country. They have fled because they are seeking peace. They are seeking refuge. And we're seeing all this happening as the events in the world have seemed tumultuous over the last couple of years, with just seeming to turn the corner on this pandemic. There's so much uncertainty still in this world as we've seen inflation rising, we've seen issues in our global supply chain. It does make you feel anxious. If we dwell on those things, there is something still that we need to rely on if we are to cope with all that's going on in this world, because the foundation of our society has been shaken, and we need a place of refuge to turn to. And while I can't say that anything in my life could even come close to comparing to what Ukraine is going through right now, I do remember when I was in high school also facing stress, anxiety, and uncertainty, because life was continuing to weigh on more and more responsibility. And one area I like to turn to in the scriptures at that time was the Psalms, because David often talked about God giving him deliverance, giving him peace from his enemies. And one particular favorite verse of mine is in Psalm 18. It's a verse that I memorized. I printed it out and put it on my corkboard so I could read it next to my desk. And those words were something I remembered when I went off to college. Because if I thought high school was stressful, college was even more stressful. And I remember walking in to my exams as I was walking across campus. At that point, there was nothing more that I could do to prepare. There was nothing more I could do to cope with the stress of that moment. I needed to know that I wasn't alone, that God was there with me, that He was my strength. And this verse was something I turned to help take that pressure off of me. So I'd like to read this passage now in Psalm 18, starting in verse 1, and I'll be reading from the New American Standard Bible. I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer. My God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. These are words that gave me strength as a young man, and they're still words that I like holding on to today. And David wrote these words when he was delivered from his enemies, from those that were pursuing him, from those that were aggressors towards him. And David is someone who was well qualified to write this psalm because he knew what it was like to face danger. He knew what it was like to be engaging an enemy in battle. He knew what it was like to fight a wild animal with his own hands. And he knew what it was like to be an enemy of the state, to be hunted down by his own king as Saul sought to take his life over the jealousy that he had toward him. Yet through all this instability that David had in his life, he remembered his foundation that God was with him, that God would be the one to deliver him. And while David was a mighty warrior of his time, what he talks about here in Psalm 18, they are not instruments of aggression during war, but they are instruments of defense, because he speaks of a shield and a stronghold and a place of refuge. That is where you go when you are under attack, And while David didn't necessarily always have a stronghold to go to, he did use the natural landscape to protect him when Saul was pursuing him. We know that he fled to areas like En-Gedi, which are in the mountains. So when he talks about the rock, when he talks about the fortress, he would have been using the natural landscape to protect him. As we know, he hid within the caves of those mountains. So he is weaving together these words of what he saw as being something that depicted permanence and strength. He uses this language of the natural landscape to describe what he felt as the spiritual protection he received from God. So we see this picture of permanence and trust conveyed through a rock and a fortress. So if we step back and think from a modern perspective, what do we put our trust in? We likely trust our government. We trust them to protect us, to keep us safe. We trust maybe our financial institutions to protect our investments and our assets. And if we think of the physical imagery that's often associated with a government or with a bank, you're likely thinking of pillars and a triangular pediment on top of it. And that's not a coincidence. That's a style of architecture that comes from the Greeks, from classical Greek architecture. And this is something we see if you look at the US Capitol building, or if you look at the Supreme Court building, or even here in the state of Washington, if you look at our Capitol building in Olympia, they all have that similar facade, the columns and that triangular pediment. We even see it at the New York Stock Exchange. And the architects used this facade very deliberately because they wanted to convey that the institution, that the government, was something we can rely on, something we can trust. And yet, even the Parthenon, which has been modeled after and has been a symbol of permanence and has stood for thousands of years, even that structure has crumbled over time. The stones have weathered, they have faded. And also, if we look at any of the structures that have stood the test of time, they have all faded. But God is a rock that does not fade. He is permanent. He is enduring. And like the governments and the institutions that we might rely on and trust in, they are not permanent. They might not always be here as a source and a refuge that we can rely on and trust in. But God is a faithful refuge that we can rely on. If we look to the history of Israel, we see that Israel was also drawn to this imagery of strength and power because they were in the land of Egypt. And we know of Egypt as being iconic for its monuments. It has one of the only remaining ancient wonders of the world with its pyramids. So Egypt had a presence. It had that iconic image of strength and permanence. It had a mighty army. So when the Israelites had been led out of Egypt with a strong hand, the moment that they faced fear, the moment that they heard of giants in the land that they were going to, they were afraid. They wanted to turn back to what they were familiar with. They wanted to assign a new leader to turn around and go back to Egypt. Thankfully, they didn't that time. But later in Israel's history, they did return back to Egypt. We know when Babylon came and destroyed Jerusalem and took captive all those of Judea, there was a small remnant that remained. And they, again, wanted to return back to Egypt. They wanted to return back to that place where they felt comfort, where they thought they would find safety. We read of this in Isaiah chapter 30, where God sternly warned the people not to turn back to Egypt. and yet the people wanted to carry out their own plan. In Isaiah chapter 30, verse 1, we read, "Woe to the rebellious children, declares the Lord, who execute a plan, but not mine, and make an alliance, but not of my spirit, in order to add sin to sin, who proceed down to Egypt without consulting me, to take refuge in the safety of Pharaoh, and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore, the safety of Pharaoh will be your shame, and the shelter of the shadow of Egypt, your humiliation." The Israelites were seeking the shadow of Pharaoh, the shadow of Egypt. They thought they could hide behind Egypt, when in reality, they should have been hiding in God's shadow. We see David writing of the shadow that God casts. If we turn to Psalm chapter 57, verse 1, David writes, "Be gracious to me, O God, be gracious to me. For my soul takes refuge in you, and in the shadow of your wings I will take refuge until destruction passes by." Here, David is highlighting the fact that God was his source of refuge. But even still, that refuge was something he sought when there was destruction, when there was danger, when there was a threat. Because if we're comfortable, we're not going to be seeking somewhere to run to for refuge. And you've likely heard the statement, "There are no atheists in foxholes." That was a term that came out of World War II. And it emphasizes the fact that when we are put in a situation of extreme stress and desperation, we realize our mortality. We realize how weak and vulnerable we are, and that we need to rely on God. We need his protection. And yet our faith should not be built just out of desperation alone. We need to be building a foundation, a relationship, so that when we do come to a moment of desperation, we already know our place of refuge. We already know where we will find peace. If we read in Nahum chapter 1, verse 7, the prophet writes, "The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him." Here we see that God is not only our source of refuge, but he knows those who take refuge in him, which causes us to ask ourselves, does he know that we take refuge in him? Are we waiting for a moment of desperation for him to find out? Or is that something we remind him of often in our prayers, that he is our refuge, that he is the source of our strength? Because with all that's going on in this world, there's so much that is uncertain and unsettling. And yet we need God to be with us as our foundation. Because as circumstances are beyond our control, God is ultimately the one who is in control. Because he is our rock. He is that foundation that is not hiding behind a facade of what looks permanent. He is the essence of what is eternal, what is everlasting. And that relationship with him needs to be strong. We need to be building it with him now. Because when our moment comes, when our moment of desperation, when our existential crisis, like the Ukrainians, comes to us, where will we seek our refuge? Will we seek God? Will we seek the shadow of his wings?